Good morning, good evening, everyone. I'd like to now walk you through the qualitative modelling that is being used to begin assessment of cumulative impacts for the Mid-Atlantic Ridge for deep sea vent communities, pelagic communities, and soft sediment communities. This is work that has been done by myself, Piers, and Jeff Dumbacker, from CSIRO in Australia in collaboration with a wide range of experts who all participated in extra workshops after the Evora workshop to fully build out these models. To give you an understanding of the basis for our work, we're really building it off the key elements that you need for some sort of adaptive management. And for adaptive management, you need to have a clear understanding of the objectives and desired outcomes. You have to have an assessment process that includes all potential positive and negative results from a development. And finally, a monitoring program that can test this assessment and make sure that the actual desired outcomes are being achieved. What we're talking about here is really a risk assessment and a fast risk assessment that is meant to fit inside a much larger framework for adaptive management, assessment and monitoring. So really here we're just talking about only one small part of that entire program, and other parts of that program are going to be addressed here as part of this workshop. We're building this work off the work that we have done in the Great Barrier Reef, and really looked at what are the key elements that you need to have in order to do a cumulative impact assessment. And we really mapped it out into five key steps: some sort of understandings of pressures and values, causal models that allow you to link pressures to values and their flow-on effects through the ecosystems, an understanding of the zones of influence, which bits of the system are actually being influenced, and then an assessment of risk and uncertainty. In this particular scenario, because there's often so little known about the effects of deep sea mining on deep sea communities, hydrothermal vent communities, deep sea sediment communities, and potentially pelagic communities as well, we're using an approach that builds on the basis of conceptual models. And what conceptual models represent is a working hypothesis of how the ecosystem works. So I think it's a really important thing to emphasize here. They're hypotheses. They're what our current understanding is. And as part of the further work, we may actually end up invalidating some of that hypothesis. But right now, this is our best understanding of the way that the ecosystem works and the way that different pressures, different activities will actually impact that system. So what do we do here? The first thing is we identify the important components and processes in the system. We document the assumptions of how these components and processes are related to each other. We identify the links between these components and processes and anthropogenic pressures. And finally, we identify the knowledge gaps or key sources of uncertainty. And that's exactly what we did as part of the series of virtual meetings and workshops that we held post-Evora that actually has developed the output that you see here today. So the tasks that we're going to do here for developing these conceptual models is, first we're going to identify the bounds of the system of interest. How far, what's the scope that we're actually talking about? Identify the key the key components of the ecosystems that we're interested in and their subsystems. We're going to identify the natural and anthropogenic stresses and describe the relationships between all of these things. And that allows us to build up that conceptual model, that working hypothesis of how we think the ecosystems are going to operate. So when we did the risk assessment for the polymetallic sulfides in the northern Mid-Atlantic Ridge, what we've done is really mapped out what we think are the values, the ecosystem components. We've mapped out the pressures, all the different potential mining activities and how they might interact with each other. And we've mapped out the zones of influence, the spatial context. This is the raw example of what the qualitative models actually look like. So this is the actual output of the workshops that we did. And so we built these models up through an iterative process of people getting together and describing all the different parts of the system that you can see here, and then how each of those different parts of the system relates to each other. More formally, it gets drawn up as a diagram that looks like this. So that diagram on the left gets converted into a diagram on the right, and then all of the effects, the links between those systems, the lines that you see there, are documented and referenced so that we have some sort of understanding of exactly where and how the evidence base for those particular assumptions actually comes from. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through the results for each of the two ecosystems that we looked at. So we looked at two different ecosystems. First of all, we looked at the pelagic and non-hydrothermal vent ecosystems, and secondly, we looked at the the actual active vent ecosystems. So first of all, the qualitative model for the pelagic and non-hydrothermal vent sediments ecosystems. You can see here that it contains three different components. We have a surface pelagic component marked in blue here that has cetaceans, cephalopods, plankton, birds, surface nekton, a range of different suites of species. We have a deep pelagic component which links the surface ecosystem with the deep ecosystem, and then we have a deep sea sediment ecosystem as well. And the ecosystem components that we have identified here are quite broad, but through the discussions that we had in terms of the actual groupings for each of these things, these were the sort of the groupings of different functional groups that the ecosystems actually contained. And then there was a significant amount of discussion to describe how each of those functional components of the ecosystem actually interacted with each other. The actual species that we're thinking about here are inside each of those circles. So we'd have particular things that are in particular species would be associated with swimming predators, with epithermal predators, obviously with cetaceans. So we're actually able to, by identifying the functional parts of the ecosystem, with further work, we can actually identify particular species that would actually be part of that ecosystem. So this is using that model that I showed in the previous slide. This is the model, the response of that ecosystem to a suite of different individual pressures. So what we're doing here is we're applying a single pressure, a single push into that system from one particular source. So the sources there are listed on the left, and they are a variety of different things: surface light, surface noise, turbid water surface discharge, nutrient surface discharge. Those are the pressures that come from the surface. From the mid-water, we have water column noise. Then from the benthic system, we have a suite of different benthic impacts: C4 light with a positive effect, C4 light with a negative effect, which represents uncertainty about exactly how things are going to change. Seafloor noise, turbid water and surface seafloor discharge, nutrients and seafloor resuspension, seafloor sedimentation, seafloor toxicants. So each of those things are some sort of pressure that would be put on the system as a result of a mining activity. Then we're also thinking about climate change. So there might be effects of climate change here. What we see here is where there is an increase in temperature and an increase in particulate organic matter quality. Or the flip side of that is the inverse of that. The temperature increases and there's a reduction in particulate organic matter. Same sorts of impacts happen in the deep sea as well. Pressure 2 is temperature increase and increase in primary productivity, and pressure 2 inverse is a temperature increase and a reduction in primary productivity. And what we can see here when we look at each of these is that the pressures break themselves up into a suite of different ways. Certainly from an individual pressure point of view, the one that is almost universally negative is where there is an increase in temperature and a reduction in primary productivity. You can also see that for pressures that exclusively impact the seafloor, things like turbid water, seafloor discharge, nutrients, seafloor resuspension, they affect the deep sea sediment communities, but they have no impact at all on the pelagic communities and the deep necton deep pelagic communities. So that's the grey bar boxes there. You can see are things that um, have where there is actually no change in the system as a result of a pressure. But if we look at the surface pressures that occur, we can see that there's a variety of different responses. For turbid water surface discharge and the midwater noise, we can see that those actually have quite a significant negative effect across the entire ecosystem, and the negative being the dark red and the orange color. But for some of the pressures, we can actually see that it has generally a positive input. So if there's actually nutrients discharged into the surface, then it actually has a generally positive effect across the entire ecosystem, because you're essentially providing more nutrients into the system and improving the condition, at least in this case, of most of the things that are occurring in that location. There's also a suite of places where we just can't tell if there's going to be a positive or a negative effect, and those places are shown by the light yellow. Now, by mapping each of these out individually, what we can actually start to do is develop scenarios where we think multiple things are going to happen at the same time. And the next slide, on this slide here, what we can see here, these are the results of those scenarios. So in the first scenario, scenario 1A, the question was, okay, what happens if there's some sort of surface discharge and a positive light effect? And then you can see here that we included pressures 3, 4, pressures 4 to 9, and pressures 11 to 13. And those were all the combination of pressures that hit on that system. And you can actually see there that there's generally a pretty negative effect across all of these things. And that pattern is consistent. So with the exception of the climate change, some of the climate change scenarios where there's just a general increase in primary productivity, you can see that once you start adding multiple pressures into the system, even though individually perhaps one of them didn't have a significant effect by itself, adding those multiple pressures into the system can actually have end up driving a significant impact on the entire system. What we can do here is these are the scenarios that we looked at and decided we would see where we would actually work on for out of the expert workshops and the scenarios that the experts arrived at. But it is actually possible to try different scenario combinations. So it may actually be that you look at these sorts of things and say, actually, we don't believe that one of these pressures is actually going to act in this scenario, or we want to design a new scenario. And that sort of analysis is actually quite possible by adding extra elements to the system. But what we have done here is we've really done two different types of experiments. We've done an experiment where there's surface water discharge, there's an experiment where there's seafloor discharge, and then essentially an experiment where there's some sort of climate change scenario. And again, these sorts of scenarios can be changed to look at different things. But I think the important message here is that individually, any one of those pressures may actually not have an enormous impact on the system. When you combine them together, there is obviously a very, very significant impact on the entire system. So moving now on to the qualitative models for the hydrothermally active habitats. This is the qualitative model that we developed for the hydrothermally active habitats. And I think one thing to point out straight away, obviously, it's quite a lot more complicated than the pelagic and sediment communities, and that's really a reflection of the complexity of the ecosystem as well. So our experience shows that some ecosystems are actually quite simple, but other ecosystems are really, really complicated, and this is one of the systems that actually has quite a lot of complicated parts operating in it. You can see down the bottom, there's all the different sources of all the different parts of the ecosystem: the physical environment, external sources and sinks, free-living microbes, symbionts, forms of habitat. And I think the main habitat we identified here was the mussel beds, and then secondary consumers, so all of the things that actually eat and consume the rest of the productivity of the system that's coming from the vent community. it's definitely a complicated model, and it has quite strong elements, so it's quite strong drivers associated with it, particularly through the physical environment. Again, this is our working hypothesis of the way that we think the system actually operates and the way it's actually going to change. So for this for this ecosystem, we looked at 10 different potential pressures that would actually come in and affect a hydrothermally active vent system. And I think there's an important caveat here is one of the things that very clear assumptions that we made at the beginning was that if a particular vent is mined, that would completely remove that vent. So we're not looking here at vents that are being mined. We're looking at vents that are adjacent to those vents that are being mined and how close and how far away they actually are to that mining activity. Because a mining activity will completely remove everything from any particular location, and that's the assumption that we worked at. So each of the different pressures that went into the system fell into 4 different categories: some form of habitat removal, some variation in hydrothermal flow underneath the vent and into the adjacent vents as a result of the mining activity, some sort of sediment clogging where there's sediment actually discharged and falls on species adjacent, and a form of plume toxicity, a variety of different impacts on potential plume toxicity. What's really apparent here is that for some things, it's actually sort of, there's a big negative effect, but it doesn't actually affect the rest of the community. So for example, if you removed the habitat for non-vent biota, obviously it has no effect on that habitat removal has no effect on vent biota, but it obviously has a significant effect on those non-vent biota, which is could be potentially a big thing. And throughout the rest of the system, you can see that the different pressures act in different ways across the entire system. Obviously, predators and scavengers are impacted across a wide variety of the pressures, and so so is it the supply of particulate organic matter from chemosynthetic outputs. But you can also see that there's the actual effects on the system don't necessarily have a massive effect or are actually a little bit uncertain. So for mussel beds, mussel symbionts, shrimp symbionts, grazers, suspension feeders, and detritivores, for a lot of the individual pressures, there's not really a lot of certainty about whether or not it will have a negative effect or a positive effect from the models that we developed here. But what we did then is we actually started to look at different sorts of perturbation scenarios. So in exactly the same way that we did for the deep sea, for the pelagic communities, what are the combination of things that are actually going to occur together in any sort of vent mining activity? Scenario 1 is where we had some sort of hydrothermally active deposit exploited in the same vent field as the vent that we're concerned about, an unexploited vent. Scenario 2 is where it's in a different vent field and there's some sort of change in the connectivity, the underfloor hydrothermal connectivity, and then another one where there's an inactive deposit that is exploited in the same vent field. So scenario 1 and scenario 3 are sort of similar to each other in that they're the same vent field, but scenario 1 is where it's an active vent that's being exploited, and scenario 3 is where it's an inactive vent that's being exploited. What you can see here is when we look at the combinations, the different scenario outputs here, rather than the individual pressures, when we looked at those having a positive or negative effect, and not really being that necessarily impacted, we can see once you actually start to combine all of the scenarios together, the impact on the adjacent vent communities becomes significantly greater. And what we start to see is much more negative impacts actually propagating through the system as a result of these multiple pressures occurring at the same time in the same sort of system. So a similar sort of message to the ones that in the pelagic ecosystems, which is an individual pressure by itself may not necessarily have an enormous effect on the system, but may still have a significant effect. But once you start to combine the pressures to get the pressures together, we start to see significantly larger effects propagating through the system. The scenarios give us an indication of exactly how deeply those impacts are going to occur. So the key results out of this work, it identifies where the impacts are actually going to occur under the assumptions that the model. So what we've done here is we've said we can actually identify the parts of the system that are most likely to be impacted by different forms of pressures coming from deep sea mining activities. It's possible to explore more scenarios. So start to think about changes in pressures may actually be occurred, different sorts of combinations of pressures, and that's something that could actually be explored to see whether or not different ideas about how the pressures actually are occurring together might actually change the outcome. What they actually do, though, is the scenarios also importantly identify mitigation pathways, sorry. So as you saw, individually, a single pressure by itself has an impact on the system, but it doesn't affect the entire system very often. It's once you start to put multiple pressures into the same system that we're starting to see really significant impacts propagating through that entire ecosystem. What this work does is it identifies both the things that we should be monitoring, the ecosystem components that we should be monitoring in order to detect impacts, but it also allows us to identify mitigation pathways. So whether you might be able to effectively remove one pressure through some sort of technical innovation that would stop that pressure from occurring. So you may be able to, for example, remove some sort of surface and deep water sediment discharge. That actually would then remove that entire pressure out of the system, and so it would no longer be considered part of the scenario. So it allows you to start to think about different options in terms of mitigation and where you would be looking to see those mitigation pathways occurring. The key next steps, and obviously this is some of the things that will be discussed next week as well, are things around monitoring questions. What will be impacted by what pressures and over what timescales? What's the best indicators for these species and groups? And what are standard operating procedures for monitoring? How do we make sure that the measurements that we take are repeatable and comparable? And obviously the collection of data and improving ecosystem understanding as we're moving through that monitoring process. Thank you very much.